Modern asymmetrical warfare blurs the boundary between immediate physical danger and perceived digital threats. We see this play out when kinetic strikes sever power grids, plunging cities into darkness, while simultaneously flooding the cellular networks with emergency data. During the recent 12-day conflict between Iran and Israel, the civilian population endured intense overnight ballistic missile barrages. Military defense systems intercepted incoming fire directly over residential areas, triggering over 21,000 separate home front command alerts. The human autonomic nervous system contains a biological limitation. It evolved exclusively to process acute, localized threats, a sudden predator or a brief environmental hazard. It lacks the physiological architecture to process a continuous 12-day bombardment. Today, that physical threat is endlessly mirrored and compounded by digital infrastructure. Following a kinetic strike, individuals immediately turn to the glow of smartphones, where the algorithmic newsfeed delivers an unrelenting stream of secondary threat cues. The combination of open-ended physical danger and relentless digital updates traps the brain in a prolonged emergency state. The biological mechanisms required for physiological baseline recovery are completely blocked by the constant influx of new threat data. When the nervous system's baseline cannot recover, immediate physiological breakdown occurs. This deterioration begins specifically with the disruption of sleep architecture, as the body refuses to enter deep restorative phases while registering active environmental danger. This graph illustrates autonomic arousal over time. The baseline wave spikes radically and flatlines in a high red zone. This represents hyperarousal, a clinical state where the nervous system faultily adapts to its environment by remaining permanently activated, anticipating the next physical siren or digital push notification. Maintaining this sustained plateau exacts a heavy psychological toll. The mind deploys emotional detachment and dissociation as biological defense mechanisms to shield the prefrontal cortex from total data overload, leading to severe mental fatigue. The physical aftermath of kinetic strikes compounds this condition. When individuals walk past destroyed infrastructure and lose their sense of tangible safety, it amplifies a deep psychological need to reestablish control over their environment. When physical control over a geographic environment is lost, human behavior instinctively pivots. Individuals attempt to assert informational control by obsessively consuming digital media, treating data gathering as a proxy for physical security. This behavior is detailed by uses and gratifications theory. Uses and gratifications theory is a framework explaining that individuals actively and intentionally choose specific media to fulfill distinct psychological needs. In this case, users actively seek out highly negative, traumatic content to mentally map external threats. This creates a dangerous loop. The evolutionary urge to regain control by gathering crisis information fuels the exact autonomic hyperarousal it is attempting to soothe. We can track the precise cost of this behavior by shifting our focus from the physical war zone to the massive data trail left by users compulsively tracking crises online. This scatterplot maps tens of thousands of data nodes from a causal inference study conducted on the Blue Sky platform. By tracking 81,345 treated users, researchers quantified the exact psychological cost of engaging with a crisis newsfeed. The study's methodology relied on propensity score matching. Propensity score matching is a statistical technique that constructs comparable groups from observational data to isolate the effect of a single variable. This allowed researchers to accurately compare active news consumers against an active control group of non-consumers. The primary finding of the data model is stark. Exposure to the crisis newsfeed triggers a severe and immediate spike in symptomatic mental health expressions across the user base. Looking at this bar chart comparing the groups, we can quantify the affective outcomes using the relative treatment effect, or RTE. RTE is a metric that calculates the ratio of an outcome in a treated group versus a control group. The data shows an RTE of 1.51, marking a massive increase in expressions of depression among the treated group. Layering in the secondary affective outcomes from the data model, we see an RTE of 1.36 for expressions of anxiety and 1.28 for expressions of stress. Routine crisis news engagement undeniably strains emotional well-being. The statistics prove that relying on a digital feed as a proxy for threat tracking is biologically toxic. However, assuming that all crisis scrolling is purely destructive misses a highly counterintuitive behavioral metric embedded in the dataset. While depression and anxiety spike, the data shows a concurrent, measurable decrease in loneliness among the treated users who engaged with the newsfeed. During a geopolitical crisis, social media facilitates a vital collective sense-making function. The rapid pulse of communication allows dispersed individuals to process reality together. The behavioral proof lies in the engagement metrics. Users in the treated group are observed commenting on and quoting posts at substantially higher rates than the control group. This dynamic is a systemic trade-off. Users subconsciously sacrifice their individual emotional stability in exchange for social participation and collective anchoring. In a physical war zone, physical isolation rapidly amplifies trauma. When geographic mobility is restricted, digital connection becomes a flawed but necessary lifeline. This poses a critical question. If digital connection acts as a biological protective factor against isolation, why are the overall affective outcomes for these users still overwhelmingly negative? The social benefits of digital connection are being overpowered by one specific, highly toxic modality of engagement, and it is a behavior that most users don't realize they are executing. The method of interacting with the 24/7 news cycle is the ultimate variable dictating the severity of psychological deterioration. The damage stems primarily from passive retention behaviors. These are everyday actions like bookmarking news items, saving headlines to read later, or endlessly scrolling without interacting. This coefficient chart compares the psychosocial impact of different engagement types. It reveals a staggering statistical anomaly. The quantity of bookmarking has a 1,900% greater psychosocial deterioration effect than other forms of engagement. The clinical mechanism behind this anomaly is straightforward. Passive retention hoards trauma data without processing it, maximizing the cognitive load placed directly on the brain. Contrast this with active participatory behaviors like commenting or quoting. These actions force the user to synthesize the information, effectively externalizing the anxiety and diffusing the internal pressure. This frequency table measures mental fatigue and illustrates digital fatigue theory. Digital fatigue theory is a framework describing how repeated, unprocessed exposure to distressing information drains cognitive resources over time, leading directly to the high percentages of severe burnout seen here. The illusion of gaining control by silently collecting crisis information is a neurological trap. It internalizes the geopolitical threat without providing the protective benefits of social externalization. Failing to process this accumulated cognitive load yields severe long-term clinical consequences, specifically manifesting as emotional numbness and profound apathy. These symptoms are not signs of mental weakness. They are adaptive, biological protective mechanisms deployed by the psyche to insulate an organism against absolute neurological overload. If this hyper-aroused state becomes the permanent baseline for an entire population, it introduces the severe risk of intergenerational trauma transmission. This is a process where the psychological and biological effects of severe trauma are structurally passed down to offspring. To counter this pathology, clinical psychologists deploy evidence-based interventions designed specifically to force autonomic downregulation and break the arousal cycle. The primary neurological mechanism used is bounded exposure. Bounded exposure is the practice of strictly limiting media consumption to specific, predetermined windows of time, mechanically interrupting the constant feed of threat cues. Mental resilience in wartime is not about ignoring geopolitical reality. It is about intentionally regulating the autonomic nervous system to prevent chronic system failure. The human brain requires proof of safety. Routine preservation serves as the primary, vital biological signal that informs the prefrontal cortex that the existential danger is not absolute. Engaging in mundane, highly controllable activities, like strict work schedules or structured physical movement, mechanically forces the nervous system out of the emergency state. Furthermore, the data proves the necessity of prioritizing active human connection over passive algorithmic consumption. Synthesizing fear through conversation clears cognitive load. Hoarding headlines multiplies it. The stark reality is that individuals cannot dictate the macro timeline of geopolitical conflicts, ballistic missile strikes, or global crises. Because the macro timeline is entirely out of our hands, focusing strictly on localized personal control is not a retreat from reality. It is a strict biological survival imperative. The clinical directive is clear: limit passive data hoarding, enforce strict boundaries on digital alerts, and aggressively maintain physical routines. We cannot eliminate the kinetic physical threats of modern crises, but we can actively dismantle the digital feedback loops that weaponize our own nervous systems against us.